This is the third part of the video for week number 4, CM502. We're going to talk about conflict and crisis. His name was Ben, and he was the head trustee of the church, and a man of few words generally. In fact, just a little bit on the edgy side. Sometimes his words were pretty profane. But we always knew that Ben cared about his church, but he also cared so passionately that at times he could get pretty overwrought about things. And you could generally tell Ben's feelings by his face. The redder his face got, the angrier or the more frustrated he was. I remember that the church spent some time talking about something that they needed to do, a new program or a new process. And after a couple of months of discussion, we had a meeting in which we took a vote and we approved that decision to move forward. But at the very next meeting, as the council president named Bob and I were approaching the hall where we were going to have the next meeting, we found Ben in the hallway blocking our way. He was red-faced. And we looked at him and we didn't try to avoid him, even though we didn't always like what it meant for him to have a red face. But we said to him, Ben, what's the matter? And he began to sputter out, that thing that we voted on last month, I think that was the worst decision we've ever made. It was absolutely the wrong thing to do, and we should not have done it. Bob, my council president, who was a very reasonable man, just simply said, Ben, but we discussed this at some length. If you had objections, why didn't you express those objections at that time? Why didn't you tell us, I just cannot agree with this? And Ben looked right at Bob, who was a professional man, and myself, the pastor, and he said, because men like me don't tell men like you no. Spirit prompted me to say to Ben, oh no, you have it all wrong. Men like me need men like you to say no at times because we need to make sure that we are on the track with the Lord. And then with your permission, we're going to go back into the council meeting. We're going to reopen the question one more time and let you talk about why you had opposed or do oppose this decision. And we'll let the council discuss it with you, which we did. In fact, I went in with Ben's permission and said, Ben has some objections to the decision that we made. He did not voice them all at the time, but now he really needs to voice them and we need to hear him. So let's talk with him. And as he began to outline his concerns, not the two men in charge answered him, but the other people around the table tried to explain to him why they thought it was a good idea. And in the end, Ben heard, having been heard them, and we moved forward. Conflict is an ever-present reality in an ever-changing and fallen world. It is an ever-present reality even in the church. In your reading, you see that Norman Chavchuk reminds us that there are at least 3 types of conflicts. One is that interpersonal conflict, is essentially conflict between individuals. It's the conflict that Matthew talks about when it says, if a brother has sinned against you, you go and talk to him. And if you cannot convince him at that point, you take a second person with you to be your witness, and you discuss it with him. And I've always understood that the purpose of that second person is not to simply validate what you've said or to support you, but to hear what both of you say and perhaps say to you, you're out of line or you're wrong. But if that person refuses to be reconciled, then you take them before the church. If that person decides that their personal position is more important than anyone else's, then you have to discipline them, which may even mean ask them to leave the church. The second is a conflict over programs or methods, contemporary worship or traditional worship, electives in Sunday school or Bible study Sunday school. We can go on and on and on with the list, and people often have very serious disagreements initially over those things, conflicts that arise, perhaps because of the price that's being paid. You know all the reasons why people resist change or create a crisis. But what you need to do in those situations is to kind of find that middle ground upon which all of you can live. That's the time when compromise is often a very important thing to do. But particularly what's important is if you can resolve it so both sides can agree. And then the third is the conflict over core values. It's where someone holds a position that clearly undermines what you believe the Bible teaches or clearly undermines the shared values the church operates by. And those are the people that Kenneth Hawkes says you have to have a come to Jesus meeting with. Then you have to say, you either have to agree or you have to step out or step away. When I think about that, I understand that some conflict is simply the result of our ever-changing world, and some conflict occurs even when you're making positive and necessary changes. But one of the things that happens is you often see a crisis that occurs, and one of the things I've often said to people, and I tell people they have freedom to say that a person's lack of planning, for example, doesn't make a crisis for me. Not everything is a crisis, just to the person who's raised it. What's the definition of crisis? Well, crisis is a noun. As a noun, it means a time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger. It's a time when difficult or important decisions must be made, as in a crisis point in history. There are synonyms for crisis like slump and depression, or a decision point or situation, a turning point. A crisis is an unstable situation, as in political or social or economic affairs, involving an impending or abrupt or decisive change. A crisis can be a sudden change in the course of a disease or fever toward improvement or deterioration, or it can be an emotionally stressful event or a traumatic change in a person's life, a point in a story or drama when a conflict reaches its highest tension and must be resolved. They're all conflicts. In fact, Scott McKnight says that it is out of crisis that we become Christians, that we make a decision for faith. When, whether over a long period of time or over an immediate circumstance, the way that we have operated no longer works and we have to make a change. Now, there are seasons when conflict is likely. Dale Huff uses a list when he teaches church conflict, which he gets from the book Mastering Conflict and Controversy by Edward Dobson and Marshall Shelley. And in that book, they quote Joe Schurer of New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, who shares this list. And here's the list. The following times in the life of a church when conflict is liable to surface, and if you're really dealing with unhealthy conflict, this may be especially critical. Number one is during the Easter season. It's the busiest time in the life of the church. There's an intensity of numbers. There are high expectations. There's a spiritual dimension, and the doctrinal issue flies in the face of Satan, because we're talking about the resurrection and he's pushing back. Or there can be conflict between the pastor and the music leader of the amount of preaching versus music in a service. The second time that crisis is likely, or conflict, is during a stewardship campaign or budget presentation. When you talk about money, people get really uptight. When you talk about committing to what you give, people get very uptight. Conflict can arise when you add a staff, because there will be people who do not consider that staff person necessary, or don't like the price of that staff person, or don't like who you've chosen as a staff person. Conflict can arise when the basic leadership style or approach of the church changes. Conflict arises when the pastor is absent, if he's on vacation or a mission trip or is off speaking somewhere, because often when the pastor is absent, those persons who are the below the surface critics often try to stir up trouble. In one church, I always dreaded coming back from vacation because I knew I'd be facing a crisis. Another was following a change in the pastor's family. Most people want to feel good about their pastor, but most have an idealized view of the pastor's family, and when something doesn't go quite right, there's a crisis. Or during the birth of a baby, a pastor will spend more time at home and less time with the church family. Or when that pastor has a wayward teenager or a similar family crisis. Conflict can arise in the church because he has to focus or she has to focus on their family. And people see that their needs, quote unquote, are not met, especially if they expect the pastor meets their needs. Another is when there's significant generational change in the focus of the church. When baby boomers started coming into the church, although people welcomed those numbers to return and the age of those numbers returned, what baby boomers expected from church was so significant, and there were so many baby boomers that they really began to make the church shift gears. Ironically, upon the completion of the new building is a time of conflict. The church has had excitement and a dream. The church family has raised a lot of money and given a lot of money, and now we have this new building, and it is not perfect. One of my favorite stories is when I was at Landisville, we built a multi-purpose ministry center, which had a gym, which had a carpeted floor, so that we could use it for many purposes, like dinners and so forth. We could play basketball anyway. But we had a kitchen committee who were so concerned about the appearance of that carpet on that floor that they wanted to make a rule that said there would be no red or purple beverages or food served in that room. Now think about that a minute. What happens to spaghetti dinners? What happens with red Kool-Aid? They went to the trustees and said that they wanted to do it, and the trustees kind of wimped out, and they assigned it to my associate who managed the building to make the decision. And he basically said there's not going to be that rule. I still remember that one morning I'm in the building and a group of ladies came up to me and said, "What do you think of Pastor Barry's decision that we're going to have this anyway?" I said, "Whatever he said is what we're going to do. I need to support him." But I went into his office and told him about the problem. So he came right out of his office. He walked up to the ringleader. He opened the refrigerator, pulled out a bottle of ketchup, and then said, "Come with me into the fellowship hall," that beautifully new carpeted fellowship hall. And when they went in, he says, "Sooner or later, we're going to have a spill in here. So let's just have it now and get it over with." "Oh, no, 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 please don't do that," was her response. And he said, "Oh, well, I won't do it now because it's not really an accident. But on the other hand, it is going to happen sooner or later. Get over it." Conflict arises when there's a rapid loss or rapid increase in church membership. Sometimes you can have so many people start to disappear, especially in a small church, that ministries are undermined because they're gone. Or sometimes you have so many new people in the church, you can't find a way to make them all fit, and the crowd is too great. Always during the time between a pastor conflict arises, there's a jockeying for position and power as there's a leadership vacuum. And conflict can arise because church councils and administration of the church have this kind of functional mentality that they just worship the process so much that they are not creative and open to things that need to be adjusted or to give a little grace and forgiveness instead of always focusing on permission. We're going to return with one more video on the importance of conflict management.